And I will say, in part, this connects me back to the work I did at Airbnb. When I was working at Airbnb, we would be thinking through what is Barcelona and Amsterdam and London and Paris, right? How are they going to approach this activity? And, I mentioned Japan earlier, which is now for the first time starting to look at hemp, right? After hemp was eradicated, after the American occupation past World War II, we stamped down their longstanding hemp industry. So first and foremost, it's just a pleasure for me to be able to look at these different experiments, having that prior experience. And it's just, as a citizen of the world, not to get too grandiose, it's a beautiful thing to be able to look at what these folks are doing and to understand their cultures and their concerns. So that's again why this is just so fulfilling to me.
Next in line, Hirsh Jain, CEO and founder of Ananda Strategy, is used to delving deep into the regulatory maelstrom. Formerly global policy lead at Airbnb, over the last few years he's switched the short-term rental market for the curious world of cannabis. We chat with him about what's coming next. Hello and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, and it's another lovely sunny day here in the UK. How are you finding it, Jamie? Are you surviving this late heat wave of September? Because I'm over it personally.
Yeah, no, 100% over it. I'm also wrestling with the fact that I've now got to a point in my life where I don't like quote unquote bad coffee, and I recognise that I'm now that person who can't drink bad coffee. We took a trip, didn't we, Dave? We were in Norway last week, and we had some reasonably bad coffee, when you get really bad hotel coffee. And I recognize now that I don't know that I was ever a man of the people, but I'm definitely not a man of the people anymore when it comes to coffee, because I was at the end of my wick over that.
That's it. It's like anything, isn't it? There's no point in having, bad wine, bad coffee, or bad weed for that matter. But, sometimes when it comes to the weedness, it's hard to almost differentiate a little bit, I think, sometimes, unless you're kind of a real sort of connoisseur of the plant itself and you have knowledge. And on the subject of knowledge, this is my nice little segue into introducing our guest today, who is Mr. Hirsh Jain, CEO of Ananda Strategy. And you're based out in California, so you know all about the weather and the good weed, I'm guessing, sir. How are you anyway?
I'm doing great. Based in Los Angeles, so I know all about good weather and good weed. And Dave and Jamie, thank you so much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Not at all, sir. You're most welcome. So you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you kind of into the cannabis industry, because you started out in law and now you've kind of gone heavy into policy, and you worked at Airbnb for a while. And how did you go from kind of short-term rentals to cannabis? Tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Northern California, and people that are familiar with the Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco area know that cannabis is a big part of the culture. So, first and foremost, cannabis has been a big part of my life for a long time, since I was young, probably a little too young. So that's the first way that I come to this is a love of cannabis. I went to UC Berkeley, which is also very cannabis friendly, as you may know. And there I worked in the public defender's office as the cannabis lead. And what that basically meant was defending students that were accused of cannabis violations by the university. And, this was only 15, 20 years ago. But back then, even if you had a small amount of cannabis, it could jeopardize your financial aid. You could potentially be kicked out of school if you had more than a certain amount. So that developed my interest in criminal justice issues and cannabis advocacy. After that, I went to law school at Harvard, where I did a lot of work on the war on drugs. And just briefly, I got to work with a couple of academics that are, both of whom recently passed away, but just to highlight their names, are Charles Ogletree, one of the great race and criminal justice scholars in American history, very famously, a mentor to Michelle and Barack Obama. I got to do a lot of work with him, and he passed away a couple of months ago, recently. And if you read about him, one of the most iconic legal giants of the past half century. I did a lot of work with him on the racially disproportionate impact of the war on drugs. And another woman named Lonnie Guinair, again, she's known as someone who worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, helped extend the Voting Rights Act throughout the 1980s. Did a lot of work with her on drug policy too. So that's all a way of saying, academically, I developed a deep interest in these issues, and I got to be mentored by a lot of great people. And then, after graduating from law school, as you mentioned, Dave, before I jumped into cannabis, I did a couple of different things. I worked at McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm, in their public sector practice. I think the short story there is I learned a lot, but I, was a little too corporate of an environment for me. So, learned some things, but that wasn't really what I saw doing with my life, helping banks and healthcare companies and other entities. And then after that, I got a job at Airbnb, and that's, really kind of what led me into cannabis. And what I mean by that is I was lucky to join Airbnb at a relatively early time when, they were growing, but still trying to build a legal and regulatory framework around, this activity. And quite frankly, just by dumb luck, I got assigned the job of negotiating their policy agreements all around the world. They're like, this guy seems smart. He has a law degree. And even though I was underqualified, this is a technology company where a lot of people aren't really capable of interacting with government officials. So the short story there is that I spent a few wonderful years traveling the world, getting to negotiate Airbnb's policies around the world. I got to live in Japan and, sort of pass the Airbnb laws there. And what I had realized after a few years is that I had negotiated most of the policy agreements in major American cities. I was watching the cannabis movement with great interest and attention, and I knew I had to work in cannabis given my passion for it. So I had this idea that the same skill set could translate into cannabis. And that was about 5 years ago that I made the jump into cannabis. And it's been just the best decision really of my life and the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. And so that's kind of how it all came together.
Yikes. I mean, before we jumped on this call, you dropped a very humble brag, which was that you could talk about Ohio for 3 hours. But in future, I would lead with studied at Harvard, worked at McKinsey. That's probably that's the mic drop one to start with, right?
Right. Do you think has anyone else heard of those places though?
I'm not sure.
I think it rings a bell. Harvard. No, absolutely. I mean, like you say, wow, that sort of pedigree speaks for itself, sir. Absolutely. But I mean, in terms of, so again, are you kind of trying to do similar to kind of helping negotiate a lot of the kind of, or navigate the legal framework of cannabis globally now? Is that kind of your intent, building on what you did at Airbnb?
Yeah, I think the two passions really I have are for cannabis and for what you might call law and policy. Those are two things that I love very much. And so that's why working in the space is so fulfilling. And really what I try to do is to understand and influence the regulatory and legal architecture of cannabis, primarily in the United States, but also around the world. And, you are well aware that, in the US in particular, we have a very decentralized governing structure when it comes to cannabis, right? We have all of these states that are taking different approaches, and I'm sure we can talk about that in our conversation, and then so much happening at the local level. So really what I try to do is just understand the mechanics of all of these distinct state markets. And then my goal is twofold. One, to help companies of many sizes navigate that. If you're a small dispensary operator or a large retail chain or a brand, like how do you think really intelligently about the state's regulatory framework that you're in as you seek to expand? How do you think intelligently about what other states you want to get into? If you're a fund, how do you think about how state level changes will impact your portfolio companies? So that's what kind of pays for stuff, so to speak, right? Is the private sector work on behalf of clients of all kinds. And I'll just quickly say, one of the greatest things about this job is I get to work with all of these really talented entrepreneurs. Quite frankly, people who are much more talented than I am. I could never run a retail dispensary, but I get to work with these people who are incredible at it and help them navigate something that is unfamiliar to them so they get to open up their next store. So that's the part of the work that, say, pays the bills. But really what my deep passion is to use that information to try to influence the public policy discussion in a positive direction that achieves the outcomes that I think we all care about, right? Like patient access, et cetera. And, I'll just conclude by saying, just by virtue of there being so many things going on, like there are very few people who are devoting all of their time to paying attention to what is happening every day, kind of in every market around the world. And it's not so much deep intelligence, but if you just like focus on it, you can start to put puzzle pieces together and hopefully speak to journalists and elected officials and other stakeholders and try to tell a story about what's going right and what's going wrong. And as I'm sure you all are well aware, in the US, we have some examples of what's going right, but we have a lot of examples of what's going wrong. And my goal is to help us all understand that and figure out how do we get to a better place going forward.
Absolutely. Just on that, what states are doing it right? I always hear a lot of criticism. they didn't do that right, but where is actually doing it right? It's easier to kind of pick out the negative sort of examples, I feel sometimes. But what are you kind of excited about? Which both, I guess, markets that have established themselves already and ones that are sort of coming online?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, for me at least, one of the most exciting parts of the conversation. Right? Because you can look at all of these different state experiments. And as you just said, Dave, like who's doing it well? And I think that's fun, right? To point out different examples. And I think many people will tell you nobody's doing it perfectly. But to your question, there are examples of folks that are doing it right. So just to give you a few, Missouri, you've probably heard a lot about Missouri. Many folks may have. What is Missouri doing well? Missouri's doing a number of things well. First, they have some of the lowest taxes, actually the lowest taxes in the country, right? They have a 6% state tax. Local municipalities can pass a tax, but it's capped at 3%. And I know we're getting kind of wonky here, but if you compare that tax structure to something like California's, where there's no limits on what cities can tax you, they can tax you 10%, the state taxes you 15%, right? There's a bunch of hidden taxes. Missouri has low taxes, and that just makes legal cannabis cost competitive. So that's really cool. In Missouri, you can see and smell the product, right? The way you would a vegetable. In other states, the product, you can't see it, you can't smell it. But in Missouri, you can engage with it as if you were at a grocery store. That's great. In Missouri, they allow drive-throughs from day one, right? There's really no reason why a drive-through, right, should be such a big deal, but that's a really convenient way to access product. They allow delivery from day one. And, some of the more mature West Coast markets, even Washington, Oregon, right, they're only now starting delivery. So I think that's really exciting. And I'll give you maybe one or two other examples. Minnesota, a market that is still in the process of coming online, is doing some really exciting things. And what's exciting about Minnesota? Minnesota is the first state that has essentially pared back what we in the US call local control, right? So in California, we legalized cannabis almost 7 years ago, but we said, hey, there are 500 cities in California. Each of you can decide whether you want to allow cannabis sales. So we decriminalized cannabis, and then we allowed all of these cities to ban legal cannabis sales. And so predictably, an illegal market has flourished. Minnesota, on the other hand, said, hey, if you're a city of 12,500 people, you have to have at least one dispensary. And so what we know will happen in Minnesota is that there will be robust cannabis access everywhere. And what makes that particularly exciting is if you just pull up a US map of Minnesota and you look at all of the prohibition states that it borders, the Dakotas, Iowa, Wisconsin, the folks who open up those dispensaries in those small towns on those borders will do incredibly, incredibly well. So that's exciting. And just one more thing about Minnesota, since I was just there and got to kind of tour the market and meet some of the players. The other thing that is really exciting and that is totally unique about Minnesota is they have taken the most permissive approach to hemp CBD beverages. What I mean by that is if you go to Minnesota, you can walk into just like a normal pizza restaurant, and instead of ordering a beer, you can order a THC beverage. Nowhere else in the United States is that allowed to that extent. Now, I imagine there's some folks that aren't happy about that. If I have, one of the big licenses in Minnesota, maybe I'm not stoked that a citizen can go in and buy it from a pizza shop. But I got to tell you, just being on the ground there, the normalization impact that has had has been remarkable. And just one stat that really blew my mind when I was there that I learned is that out of the 180 craft brewers in the Craft Brewers Association in Minnesota, 40 of them are either producing or distributing cannabis beverages. And that is quite remarkable given the oppositional logic that alcohol and cannabis have in other states. So those are just a couple of examples of really exciting things, I think.
I think it's really interesting the way you sort of, I guess, position your kind of interest in it and what you would classify as doing well, and a state that's doing a good job. And you mentioned having low taxes. I really appreciate the way that you specified that it was around access to cannabis. Talking about low taxes in general, that's not the specialism here. We're talking about access to cannabis, talking about undermining an illegal market. If you improve access, physical access, you reduce, the need for an illegal market. If you increase the ability to operate a business that is doing cannabis legally, you increase the access and therefore reduce an illicit market. And I think as soon as we start talking about it in those terms, the impact of good and bad policy becomes a lot more clear. Because I think from the sidelines, everyday person who is maybe pro cannabis, maybe they don't really understand kind of where legislation and policy creation sits in terms of driving the kind of movement forward.
Yeah, it's like, what does it mean for them? That's
Exactly,
it. Day-to-day. Any politics, it's like, well, if I vote for this party, then they'll sort this out and I'll be happy, but then you don't think, well, what's the day-to-day implications of that?
Right.
Nothing, like you say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's understanding how what you do fits in alongside the people who are doing the grassroots, campaigning and things like that. And I guess the question is maybe a pretty broad one, but how do you see that fit and that position in terms of policy, and how does it connect with people who are maybe part of a the movement more broadly, who aren't making policy decisions or informing policy? Where do you see that connect?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I agree with everything that you just said on how these issues are framed. And my very simple answer here is I think of it as storytelling, right? How do we connect these policy choices to the values that we say we care about, right? Like, how do we connect low taxes to the values that we say we care about, right? Access to cannabis, local control, right? That I was just talking about, which seems like kind of an arcane concept. How do we connect that to what we care about? I mean, what I mean by that specifically is how do we examine the data about how convenient access to cannabis impacts consumption and say decreases consumption of other pharmaceutical alternatives? And so I think our objective as policy people should be connecting these different policy approaches to the goals that we say we care about. And I think most people that are involved in cannabis, there are ethical reasons that undergird our desire, right? Whether they be medical in nature, health oriented in nature, criminal justice in nature. So I think it's connecting those dots. And again, what I think is good about the United States is by virtue of its very decentralized policymaking structure, if we all just took a minute and looked at what was going on in all of these different places, put our kind of like ideologies aside and ask ourselves how they're actually achieving their intended outcomes, we can get to a better and better place.
Yeah, it's subjective based sort of learning and then action, and it's always bringing it back to what is the overarching goal here. And I guess for people who want cannabis to be a thing, it's making cannabis a thing, and how do you do that? And it's building an industry that supports that goal rather than the other way around, having a goal that people can happen to be able to make money on. It's not quite the same thing, and it's a difference in perspective. I suppose looking more broadly, it sounds like a lot of your experience obviously is within the US. When you look kind of further afield, around the world, and looking at rec legalization in particular, do you see anywhere else doing a really good job? There's kind of some on the horizon, some have just done it. Yeah, what are you seeing kind of internationally?
Yeah, it's really fun for me to survey the international scene. And I will say in part, this connects me back to the work I did at Airbnb. When I was working at Airbnb, we would be thinking through what is Barcelona and Amsterdam and London and Paris, right? How are they going to approach this activity? And, I mentioned Japan earlier, which is now for the first time starting to look at hemp, right? After hemp was eradicated after the American occupation past World War II, we stamped down their longstanding hemp industry. So first and foremost, it's just a pleasure for me to be able to look at these different experiments, having that prior experience. And it's just, as a citizen of the world, not to get too grandiose, it's a beautiful thing to be able to look at what these folks are doing and to understand their cultures and their concerns. So that's again why this is just so fulfilling to me. Now, on your question about who's doing it well, I think my meta comment would be, we are seeing around the world something similar to what we have seen in the United States, which is to say, oftentimes there's grand rhetoric about passing like legalization initiatives, but in many instances, those have fallen short. So I guess that would be my biggest takeaway. I remember in Mexico, when I met with a bunch of senators from Mexico when they were touring California 5 years ago about the imminent legalization in Mexico. And, quite frankly, we've seen how that has turned out. In Colombia, a new president was recently elected on a campaign to pass cannabis legalization, and that has kind of faltered. In Berlin, right, which I know you all are familiar with. I'll share my opinion, but I'd be curious to hear yours. I was so excited to go to Berlin for the first time in 2022 and hear all the grand talk about legalization. And, by dumb luck, I got to meet with 8 members of the Bundestag and got to talk to them about policy. And a year later, when we were at the conference a few months ago, those plans had been pared back. And so I would say, there's a little bit of disappointment in that a lot of the outcomes have not matched the rhetoric. And I will also say that half measures, in my opinion, are doomed to fail in the same way that California has had challenges by legalizing cannabis, allowing cities to ban cannabis. Similarly, one challenge with, Germany going halfway is it could contribute to the illicit market. So I'll just say those are, maybe some of my more critical or hard-nosed thoughts on how things haven't, how we haven't gotten all the way there yet. With that being said, if I'm being fair, right, if we're all being fair, there's no way, if you look at the reform movements that are happening in Europe, right, however slowly, even if it's one incremental step, there's no way you can look at Europe and not say, wow, there is a real conversation happening in almost a dozen countries there. And so that makes me optimistic. And so even if they haven't gotten it quite right yet, I think there are strong trend lines. And the final thing I'll say is, I'm really excited for the day when India, which is where I'm from, finally returns to its origins of cannabis as medicine. And I think we're a far way off, but I'm excited for us to get there.
Absolutely. I think no, I think I'd pretty much agree with you on the Germany aspects of things. It seems like, oh, this is all good. Again, 2022 ICBC, it was like, just in time for that. It was like, oh, so much is going to happen. Everyone was excited, and all of a sudden it's like a year later, it's not really happening. What's kind of happening? Oh, you've got the kind of two-pronged approach to things, and it just seems like it's going to add even more time. And then at the same time, you've got Luxembourg going, oh, we're going to legalize it now. Actually, you can have some. But again, we're dealing with very different kind of, geographies and kind of, populations and things like that. And I guess it's like Malta just kind of legalized overnight sort of thing. It just comes out of the woodwork. It's like, we can do it. And then, but what always amazes me is there's not always local appetite for cannabis. I was in Thailand over the summer, just gonna drop that in there again. And I was thinking, where I've always felt that the whole approach that in Thailand is kind of like, it's like a reverse Germany. It's like, we'll legalize it and figure out the regulatory side of it afterwards. But it's like, well, is there a lot of kind of demand for it here? Are people really pro cannabis? And speaking to people, even anecdotally, it's like CBD, yes, THC, no, because they cite the harms that potentially could happen with youth. And it's like, well, I'm not going to get into a debate with people, but no, I can see the perspective. And it's I don't know, I think a lot of the sort of Asian markets, as you mentioned, particularly in India and Japan and places like that, as well as sort of Southeast Asia, that's going to be really, really interesting, because again, it could be quite transformative for a lot of their economies as well, I think, which is in Africa also, there's totally. It's going to be so interesting. But again, it feels like, I don't know, maybe it's the outside looking in. I don't know what you think, Jamie. Kind of Europe is like, for God's sake, get a move on.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? It's where optimism meets the reality of like deeply interconnected politics. It's a lot easier, obviously, for a Luxembourg or a Malta just to do what they want, basically, because who cares? That's on the global scale. The reality. Germany's biggest economy in Europe. If they make a statement like that, what does that say, and what does it do to their allies? So it's all their detractors as well. Does it give ammunition to people who are against them? That's a really interesting thing. All the issues that we're talking about with cannabis or with anything, they're never in a vacuum. They're impacted by political decisions for totally unrelated topics. For wider agriculture, people who want other crops to be dominant. This is just as one example. There's so many reasons.
Totally.
I guess coming back to the US and looking at broader legalization, the good old federal legalization, the two words that want to crop up all the time and people want to ask about. We can ask the cliche question and say, when's it going to be? But rather than when, I suppose, what is needed for it to happen, and what do you think? Maybe who or which states do you think are going to be kind of impactful in I guess toppling that?
Who's going to swing it?
Who's going to swing it?
No, I think one of the things that pushes national legalization forward is the very interesting state-led story that's happening in the US. And that's what I'm most excited about, which is to say Minnesota, as we were just discussing, was the 23rd state to legalize adult use. There's 50 states in the US, and 25 is kind of a tipping point. And what I mean by that is, as someone who follows a lot of the discourse on cannabis quite closely, I can tell you the way this issue is framed is different than when it was at 19 states. Right now, every news article says almost half of the states have legalized cannabis, or half of Americans live in an adult use state. And so we're at 23. We were talking about Ohio before. The reason I think Ohio is exciting is that it has a ballot initiative in November, right? So on November 7th, Ohio has a ballot initiative. If it passed, it would be the 24th state. And again, not to get too wonky here, but people may know Ohio is a huge state of 12 million people. If you also look at Ohio on a US map, it borders a number of prohibition states with huge metro areas right on the border. So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is practically in Ohio. The northern Kentucky suburbs right outside of Cincinnati are basically in Ohio. Like Indiana, Indiana, that's a heavily populated region. So again, not to get too wonky here, but 20 million Americans who either live in Ohio or live just outside of it will have new access to adult use cannabis if that passes. And those who are observers of US politics know that Ohio is the quintessential like right of center, like US state. It's the red Midwestern state. It's not, crazy red, but it's the,
is it the kind of every person state? It's kind of like, this is about as normal America as you can kind of get.
Exactly. It's your conservative uncle, like not your crazy, it's your conservative uncle, like who lives in Ohio. And so there's immense symbolic power there. Republicans will take stock of what happens there. And so the really encouraging thing is that polling there is very strong, right? Potentially like 57, 58, 59% of people could support adult use. So I think that will send a signal around the country. And I think the reason actually that election will get immense attention, the reason I think you all in the UK will be reading about this 6-7 weeks from now, is that abortion rights is also on the ballot, which is an issue that is very contested in this country. So my prediction, when I see you guys next, let's revisit this. My prediction is that abortion rights and cannabis legalization in this very red state are going to pass with strong margins and will show that America on these two issues, right, even right of center America is pro what you might call freedom. And so that's very exciting. Ohio number 24. I'll mention a few other states that are exciting, and then we can get, to the point about federal legalization. But the reason I'm excited about this next, let's say 14 months before the US presidential election is I believe Ohio will be number 24. I believe New Hampshire, which, is a big presidential primary state, they're likely to vote on their bill around January, February next year. That would be 25. And again, as all of these candidates are going to New Hampshire, this very small state, it will literally, just by virtue of luck, right, that primary is held right around the time of that legislative session. So I think that'll be a big deal. And then you have the two monster states that people are watching in 2024, which are Pennsylvania and Florida, which are like bigger than Ohio, right? And if all of those states come online, no matter who the next president is, right, in 2025, 2/3 of Americans will live in an adult use state. And so I think that's part of the answer to your question, which is, sure, there's all of this gridlock at the federal level and maneuvering. And Jamie, I think you were pointing out, aptly that sometimes you're hostile to other political forces and this person's has this chairmanship. And so there's an unpredictability to all these things. However, there comes to be a point where it becomes untenable, where 2/3 of Americans live in an adult use state. And so that's what I'm most excited about, which is the state-led growth story. And then maybe the other comment I'll make is, obviously many of us are now talking, and you all have probably heard more about this than you care to, right, about what the impact of the potential rescheduling recommendation might be and what that would look like. And again, I'm sure we could talk about that for a while, but I think in short, it is an imperfect step in the right direction towards legalization. That's the best way I've heard it put, an imperfect step in the right direction. And so I'm excited for those two things to coalesce and move us forward. Absolutely.
And I think that's a good point for a lot of places, actually. It's an imperfect step in the right direction. I think that's a very savvy observation. And I think, again, it's reaching that point of no return. It's like, look, we're that far now, come on, sort of thing. But again, it'd be interesting, given like you talked about, the kind of decentralized way of sort of instigating, or things at a local level, like you mentioned in California. Certain towns it can be legal in this state, but certain towns can, the civil laws can just completely nix it out the way. It'd be interesting to see. Well, again, that's probably a good sort of problem to have for a lot of places, isn't it? It's like, we can do this, do you choose to, or do you choose not to? But again, I guess it's like you say, lots of imperfect steps, but it's momentum. And this is what I always say to a lot of people from North America when I meet them. It's like, oh, we messed it up, we didn't do it right in Canada, or California's like, going to the dogs when cannabis is concerned. I say, well, at least you have recreational adult use markets, things are happening, and again, I just think that statement seems to perfectly summarize it. But as a final, if we're going to say, put a timeline on it, I know we weren't going to say this, what do we think? It sounds like you're saying 2025, 2026 for kind of like federal legalization.
Yeah, my prediction would be that by sometime in 2024, cannabis will officially retain a Schedule III designation, right? Which would mean it's still federally illegal. And my prediction would be sometime in the next presidential term. And I want to say this even kind of regardless of who is president, sometime in the next presidential term, cannabis will be legalized. And again, I think that is because just, you'll have 30, 35 states at some point, right, that have legalized adult use. And so I guess that's a way of saying, I think we're probably 3 to 4 years away from legalization per se, but we're 1 year away from greater normalization, where we finally, as the Schedule III designation allows, right, where we finally acknowledge that cannabis has medical value. And you know, that's the first time in American history or modern American history the federal government has made that admission. So that would be a big win, of course.
No, we heard it here from here, and we'll wait and see how it shakes out, and we'll have you back when it happens, and we'll say, hey, did it shake out the way you thought it would? I'm guessing so. You seem like a very smart guy, so I'm going to say yes.
If it doesn't, let's burn it.
Yeah, we'll just edit it out. No one will be the wiser. But no, thank you so much, Hirsh. It's been a pleasure, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again soon.
I really appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you.
All right, we'll catch you later. Cheers.
See you soon.